She thought it was a farewell lunch. A thank you. A professional goodbye from the CEO whose company she had given 4 years of her best work. She had no idea what was actually coming. Neither, honestly, did he, until the night before, when he made a decision that changed everything. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We would love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. There is a particular kind of quiet that exists in workplaces that nobody talks about. It is not the quiet of an empty office after hours, or the quiet of a conference room between meetings. It is the quiet of a person who has made a decision, a deliberate, disciplined, costly decision, to say nothing. To hold something tightly inside the professional space they occupy every single day and carry it with them through every meeting, every phone call, every crisis, every mundane Tuesday, and every significant Friday, without a single visible crack. Most people cannot sustain that kind of quiet for a week. Some people cannot sustain it for a month. Idris Maxwell sustained it for 4 years. 1,461 days. And the story of why he kept quiet, and what finally broke that silence, is one of the most quietly extraordinary workplace stories you will ever hear. To understand how we got to that farewell lunch on a Friday afternoon in Atlanta, Georgia, we have to go back. We have to go back to the beginning, not just the beginning of Idris and Latifah's story, but the beginning of everything that made their story possible. Because this is not simply a story about two people who worked together. This is a story about a company built from nothing, a son who inherited more than a business, a woman who refused to be invisible in rooms that tried to make her so, and a man who chose, every single day for 4 years, to protect her work over his own feelings. That is a rare thing. And rare things deserve to be told properly. Deshaun Maxwell was not supposed to build an empire. He was not the son of wealthy investors or the product of a family with connections. He was the son of a machinist from Birmingham, Alabama, who worked a factory floor for 31 years and who believed, with the particular conviction of a man who has spent 3 decades watching other people's designs become real objects in the world, that the person who understands how something is made is always more powerful than the person who simply buys it. Deshaun inherited that conviction the way most important things are inherited, not through a formal conversation, not through a will, but through proximity. Through watching. Through the particular education that comes from growing up around a man who respected the work above everything else. Deshaun went to school on a combination of academic scholarships and money his parents had saved in increments over 15 years. He studied mechanical engineering at Alabama A&M University, graduated with honors, and entered the manufacturing industry at 24 with a degree, a notebook full of ideas, and a certainty about material systems and production processes that impressed his early employers even when his youth made them cautious. He worked for other people's companies for 11 years. He learned everything those companies knew, and he learned, more importantly, everything they didn't know about themselves. He learned where the inefficiencies lived. He learned what a well-run production line looked like versus one that had been allowed to drift through years of small compromises. He learned what strong leadership produced in a workforce and what weak leadership quietly destroyed. He was a student of all of it, and he never stopped being one. In 2001, Deshaun Maxwell leased a single floor in an industrial building on the south side of Atlanta, bought 3 used machines with money he had borrowed from his brother and saved over 5 years, and started Maxwell Industrial. The company manufactured precision-engineered parts for mid-size industrial clients, components that required exactness, reliability, and the kind of quality control that larger manufacturers often deprioritized in favor of volume. Deshaun's pitch was simple: he would make things right, he would make them on time, and if anything went wrong, he would fix it before the client had to ask. In an industry where the standard was to negotiate delays and explain defects, that pitch landed. It landed slowly at first, a contract here, a referral there, a client who told another client, but it landed consistently, and consistency is what builds companies that last. Over the next 2 decades, Maxwell Industrial grew from that single leased floor into a multi-site operation with 400 employees, 2 distribution centers, and a reputation in advanced parts manufacturing that other companies in the industry referenced as a benchmark. Deshaun had not built a flashy company. He had built a reliable one. There is a difference, and in manufacturing, the difference is everything. His clients were not impressed by marketing materials or corporate presentations. They were impressed by the fact that in 20 years of doing business with Maxwell Industrial, the company had never missed a critical deadline without warning, never delivered a defective component without owning it and replacing it, and never allowed the relationship between the company and a client to become transactional in the way that relationships so easily can. Deshawn knew his clients' names. He knew their operations. He knew what they needed before they finished explaining it. That was not a business strategy. That was a character trait that happened to produce exceptional business results. Idris Maxwell grew up watching his father. He grew up watching the early mornings and the late nights. He watched his father take calls on weekends and disappear to the facility during equipment failures and sit at the kitchen table after dinner with production reports spread out in front of him, making notes in the margin with a mechanical pencil. He watched, and he absorbed, and he made his own decisions about what he wanted. For a while, those decisions leaned away from manufacturing. Idris was interested in finance, in the broader mechanics of how capital moved through the economy, and he pursued that interest through an economics degree at Morehouse College and an MBA at Georgia Tech. He was not running from his father's world. He was building a set of tools that he thought, correctly as it turned out, would make him more useful in it. He joined Maxwell Industrial at 22, working in logistics, then quality assurance, then operations management. He did not come in as the owner's son who expected deference. He came in as someone who needed to learn the company from the inside out, and he conducted himself accordingly. He asked questions that revealed he had done his homework. He made decisions that were measured and explained. When he disagreed with something, a process, a policy, a direction, he said so directly and with evidence, not with the authority of his last name. The people who worked with him noticed this. The ones who had expected a different version of him, the entitled version, the performed version, adjusted their expectations. The ones who had waited to see what he was actually made of settled, over time, into something that looked like genuine respect. When Deshawn Maxwell decided in 2018 that it was time to step back, his doctor had been persistent, his knees had been louder, and his wife had been right about the pace for at least 3 years before he admitted it. He did not hand the company to Idris because Idris was his son. That was not how Deshawn operated, and anyone who had watched him build Maxwell Industrial understood that. He handed the company to Idris because Idris had spent nearly a decade demonstrating, through the specific, unglamorous, daily practice of showing up and doing the work correctly, that he understood what the company was, what it required, and what it could become. The handover was formal and documented and handled with the same precision Deshawn applied to everything else. And Idris, 31 years old, became CEO of a company with 400 employees, 2 decades of reputation, and a standard he had no intention of letting slip. Manufacturing companies at the scale of Maxwell Industrial in 2018 were operating in a landscape that had been shifting for years. Automation was advancing. Supply chains were under pressure. The kind of precision engineering that Deshawn had built his reputation on was becoming simultaneously more valuable and more technically demanding. To stay competitive, the company needed engineers who were not just technically sound but adaptable, people who could read both the current state of a production system and its probable future, who could anticipate problems before they became crises, and who could translate their analysis into decisions that the rest of the company could act on. This was not a simple requirement. The talent pool in advanced manufacturing engineering was competitive, and the subset of that pool that also possessed the communication skills and practical judgment the company needed was smaller still. The engineering division at Maxwell Industrial was led at the time by a man named Garrett Cole. Garrett had been with the company since Deshawn's early years, which gave him a kind of institutional authority that he wore comfortably, and sometimes, those who worked closely with him would say privately, too comfortably. Garrett was experienced. He had a thorough knowledge of the company's systems and history. He could, in a meeting, speak fluently and at length about engineering challenges in a way that sounded like expertise and often was. The difficulty, and this was a difficulty that accumulated quietly over years, the way most workplace difficulties do, was that Garrett's expertise had calcified somewhere around 2012. The industry had moved. The tools had advanced. The problems had become more complex and more interconnected. And Garrett had become, without entirely noticing it, a man who was very good at identifying what was wrong and very reluctant to commit to what should be done about it. He had perfected the language of evaluation without the willingness to bear the weight of a decision. This is a pattern that exists in organizations everywhere, and it is more destructive than it looks. A leader who will not make decisions does not simply create a vacuum. He creates a culture of delayed accountability, where problems are discussed extensively and solved slowly, where team members learn that the cost of being wrong is lower than the reward of being right, and where the people who are most capable of solving things eventually either find their way around the structure or leave the structure entirely. Research into workplace dynamics in manufacturing environments has consistently found that the single greatest driver of high-performer attrition in technical divisions is not compensation, it is the experience of having their competence outpace the authority they are permitted to exercise. When brilliant people are repeatedly required to run their best work through a filter that slows it down and dilutes it, they eventually stop submitting their best work to that filter. They find another way. Or they find another company. Latifah Callum arrived at Maxwell Industrial on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 2019. She had driven up from the apartment she rented in Decatur, arrived 10 minutes before her scheduled interview time, found parking without difficulty, and walked into the building dry despite the rain that had been falling steadily since before dawn. She was 26 years old. She had a mechanical engineering degree from the University of Alabama at Huntsville, a postgraduate certification in industrial systems design, and 2 years of fieldwork at a mid-size manufacturing facility in Huntsville where she had done the kind of work that does not show up prominently on a resume because it is embedded in the daily functioning of systems rather than in individual headline achievements. She was interviewing for a mid-level position in the production systems division. Idris conducted the interview himself, which was not unusual for him when the position was one he considered strategically important. He had reviewed her resume the night before and made notes, not talking points, but actual questions, the kind that follow from genuine engagement with what a person has done rather than from a list of standard prompts. He asked her about a fault she had diagnosed in a secondary conveyor system at her previous job, a fault that had been attributed by senior engineers to a motor housing issue but that she had correctly identified as a calibration drift in the tension control mechanism. He asked her to walk him through how she had gotten there. She did. She walked him through it without notes, without hedging, and without the particular over-explanation that people sometimes use to demonstrate competence when they are not confident it will be recognized. She explained it the way a person explains something they understood deeply, clearly, sequentially, and with the specific details that separate real knowledge from approximate knowledge. Idris wrote something in the small leather notebook he kept on his desk. He offered her the position before the end of the day. And that evening, driving home through Atlanta traffic, he acknowledged something to himself that he would not say out loud to anyone for the next 4 years. He had felt something in that interview room that had nothing to do with the interview. Something that had arrived quietly alongside his professional assessment of her capabilities and that had no business being there. He saw it clearly. He catalogued it. He told himself, with the discipline of a man who had learned to separate what he felt from what he permitted himself to act on, that it was not relevant. She was going to work for him. She was going to be part of his team. The only thing that was relevant was whether she could do the job. And she could. Obviously, extraordinarily, she could. So he moved on. Or he began the process that he would spend 4 years calling moving on. Latifah's first 3 months at Maxwell Industrial were the months she spent learning. She learned the systems, the processes, the particular rhythms of the facility. She learned which of the floor technicians had institutional knowledge that did not exist in any written documentation and needed to be drawn out through conversation and trust. She learned where the inefficiencies in the production flow had been normalized through years of small workarounds and were therefore invisible to people who had been looking at them too long. She did not arrive with a set of predetermined conclusions. She arrived with a set of questions, and she asked them carefully, of the right people, in the right order, until the answers started connecting into a picture of the system that was more complete than any single person in the building had previously assembled. This is how the best engineers work, and it is not as common as it should be. Research published by the Society of Women Engineers and confirmed by multiple studies on engineering workplace culture has found that women engineers, particularly women of color in manufacturing environments, often face a specific and exhausting professional burden. They must demonstrate competence continuously and explicitly in ways that their male counterparts are not required to do. The assumption of capability that a male engineer tends to walk into a room carrying is not extended to them automatically. They have to build it, case by case, interaction by interaction, through a sustained performance of excellence that leaves very little room for the ordinary mistakes that learning any new environment involves. Latifah understood this dynamic intuitively, not because she had read about it in a study, but because she had been living it since her first engineering internship at the age of 20. She understood the terms of the environment she was operating in. And she met them. By her 4th month, the results were showing up in ways that could not be attributed to coincidence or beginner's luck. A redesign recommendation she submitted on a packaging subassembly reduced cycle time by 11%, an improvement the division had been attempting to achieve through a series of incremental equipment adjustments for the better part of 2 years. The solution was not in the equipment. It was in the sequence. Latifah had seen this on her 3rd week, had spent 6 weeks documenting the pattern before she was confident enough in the data to submit a formal recommendation, and had presented the recommendation with the specific, annotated evidence that made it difficult to dismiss. When it was tested and confirmed, the floor technicians who had watched her build the case over those 6 weeks nodded at each other in the way that people nod when something they already sensed has been proven to be true. The fault prediction model she built in her own time, on her own laptop, over 3 consecutive weekends, submitted as a voluntary addendum to a routine maintenance report, was eventually adopted as a division-wide protocol. She had not been asked to build it. She had noticed that the existing maintenance schedule was reactive rather than predictive, that the pattern of failures in 3 specific machine types followed a detectable cycle that the current monitoring system was not capturing, and that a relatively simple algorithmic adjustment could shift the division from responding to failures to anticipating them. The model was not complex. Its power was in the clarity of its logic and the precision of its data inputs. When Garrett Cole's team reviewed it, there was a pause in the room of the kind that happens when a piece of work is better than anyone expected and no one immediately knows how to respond to that without revealing that they hadn't thought of it themselves. Garrett Cole noticed Latifah the way that insecure managers notice talent, with a mixture of recognition and threat response that produces a particular kind of careful, sustained undermining. He did not confront her directly. That was not how Garrett operated. What Garrett did was manage the narrative. In team meetings, he would frame her contributions as part of a broader team effort, accurate, technically, but framed in a way that distributed credit in proportion to his preference rather than in proportion to who had done the work. In conversations with his peers in other divisions, he would mention the engineering unit's recent improvements with a possessive ease that implied authorship. In one-on-one conversations with members of his own team, he would speak, in careful, unattributable language, about the importance of process and hierarchy and the risks of individual contributors who worked outside established frameworks. He never said Latifah's name in these conversations. He did not need to. What Garrett told his colleagues, when pressed in the way that colleagues sometimes press each other in the low-key intimacy of a shared lunch or a corridor conversation, was that the CEO's attention to Latifah had nothing to do with the work. He let that statement settle. He did not elaborate. He did not need to elaborate, because the implication was one that the culture was already prepared to receive. A black female engineer being repeatedly called upon by a CEO over the objection of her division head, there was a ready-made narrative available for that situation, and Garrett did not have to construct it from scratch. He simply left the door open and let the most convenient interpretation walk through it. Some people in the division absorbed that narrative. A few repeated it. But most of them, the ones who had watched Latifah work, who had been in the room when she presented her fault prediction model, who had seen the cycle time numbers after a redesign recommendation was implemented, who had worked alongside her on production crises and observed the specific quality of her thinking under pressure, most of them knew the truth. And the truth was that Latifah Callum had not been handed her access to the CEO's attention. She had built it, one unglamorous, meticulous, excellently executed decision at a time. The McKinsey Women in the Workplace report released in 2023 described this exact dynamic: high-performing women of color doing more, proving more, and receiving less institutional recognition than their equivalent male counterparts, even in organizations that believed themselves to be meritocratic. Maxwell Industrial was not exceptional in this regard. It was typical. The thing that was exceptional was Latifah's response to it, which was simply to keep working. The pattern that became visible to the engineering division, and eventually to the broader company, began with a materials failure in a critical component line about 10 months into Latifah's tenure. The failure was threatening a major client deadline, and the situation had been escalated to Idris through a senior briefing that Garrett Cole led. Garrett presented the problem with the thoroughness he was known for: extensive background, clear articulation of the stakes, detailed exploration of the complexity. What the briefing did not contain was a direction. After 20 minutes of presentation, Idris asked a direct question: what is the proposed path forward? Garrett gave a careful answer about the need for further analysis, about the importance of not rushing to solutions before the root cause was fully understood, about the various factors that would need to be weighed. It was a well-constructed non-answer, and the room felt it. Idris had been given, as part of the briefing package, a one-page technical annex prepared by the engineering unit. At the bottom of the page, initialed LC, was a proposed diagnostic pathway and 2 prioritized corrective options with projected timelines and resource requirements. He read it. Then he read it again. Then he asked if the person who had prepared the annex could join the meeting. Garrett's expression did not change. His posture shifted in a way that only people who were watching for it would have noticed. Latifah was called up from the floor. She arrived without notes, stood at the edge of the conference room, and answered every question Idris and his senior team put to her with the precise, grounded clarity of someone who had already done the thinking that the room was still working through. Within 25 minutes, they had a plan. Within 4 days, the component line was back to capacity. The client never knew there had been a crisis. After that meeting, Idris began reading the annex first. This was not a statement. It was not a power move or a message to Garrett or a conscious departure from protocol. It was the behavior of a CEO who had identified where the most reliable analytical thinking in a given division was coming from and who adjusted his information intake accordingly. That is what good leadership looks like in practice, not loyalty to hierarchy for its own sake, but constant recalibration toward truth. The problem was that in the context of a workplace that carried the weight of all the assumptions it carried, this recalibration looked like favoritism to the people who were not paying close enough attention to the substance of what was actually happening. Over the following 3 years, the dynamic compounded. Idris would call Latifah's extension directly when a production question required immediate technical judgment. He would include her in senior meetings where the engineering input was strategic rather than operational. He would read her reports with a line-by-line attention that he did not extend to Garrett's presentations, because her reports contained insights that Garrett's presentations did not. None of this was personal. All of it was professional. And all of it was earned. The distinction mattered to Idris with a precision that he maintained carefully, because he understood, with a clarity that was available to him precisely because he was aware of the other thing, the thing he was not permitted to act on, that if he ever allowed the professional to bleed into the personal in any observable way, he would not just compromise his own integrity. He would compromise hers. He would hand the Garrett Coles of the world exactly the evidence they needed to make the narrative stick. What Idris felt for Latifah Callum was not infatuation. Infatuation is a loud thing, it announces itself, it colors perception, it makes people behave in ways they would not otherwise behave. What Idris felt was quieter and more durable than that. It was the specific kind of regard that develops when you watch someone be excellent at something you deeply respect, and when the excellence reveals, over time, a character that the excellence alone does not fully explain. He respected her mind, that had been clear from the first interview. But over 4 years of working together, he had come to see other things. The way she listened in meetings, not waiting for her turn to speak but actually incorporating what was said before she formulated her response. The way she handled being undermined by Garrett without either becoming smaller or becoming reactive, the particular grace of a person who knows what she is worth and does not require the room to confirm it. The way she stayed late on the nights when the facility needed her and left on time on the nights when it didn't, because she understood the difference between commitment and performance. He had come close to saying something on at least 4 occasions that he could identify precisely when he thought about it afterward. The first was during a production crisis in his second year as CEO when they had worked side by side for 11 hours on a line failure and emerged from the facility at 9 in the evening into a parking lot that was quiet and lit by a single working street light, and she had said something quietly funny about the particular exhaustion of being right under pressure, and he had laughed in a way that surprised him, and the moment had been natural and warm and entirely outside the professional register, and he had let it pass. The second was in a budget review meeting where she had pushed back on a cost-cutting measure that she believed would compromise the integrity of a key production system, and she had pushed back not with deference or apology but with specific data and a directness that he found, with a private intensity that he carefully locked away, deeply attractive. The third and fourth occasions he had decided, by the time he had thought about them long enough, that he had imagined them. He had not imagined them. But the discipline of a man who has decided to protect something that is not his to claim is a powerful thing, and Idris had been exercising that discipline for long enough that it had become a reflex. He did not allow himself to linger in the moments that felt different. He moved through them the way a person moves through a room that they have decided not to redecorate, aware of how it could look, committed to leaving it as it was. Latifah had been building her plan for graduate school for 2 years before she told anyone about it. The plan had developed with the same methodical patience she applied to engineering problems: research first, assessment second, decision third. She had identified 3 programs she respected, one at the University of Toronto in Canada, one at the University of Melbourne in Australia, and one at Imperial College London in the United Kingdom. She had spent 18 months reviewing faculty profiles, reading published research from the laboratories she was most interested in, corresponding with professors via email on Saturday mornings, and quietly assembling the financial picture that would determine which offer, if the right one came, she could actually accept. She told no one because she had learned, through experience, that announcing a plan before it is real is a way of distributing your intention before you know its shape, and she was not a person who distributed things before they were ready. She was accepted to the University of Melbourne program in January 2023. Full funding, a 2-year research fellowship in a smart manufacturing systems laboratory she had been following since its first paper was published 3 years earlier. It was not a close decision. It was the right place for the work she wanted to do, with the resources and the intellectual environment that the work required, and she had known it without hesitation the moment the acceptance came through. She sat with it for 24 hours, not from doubt, but from the particular stillness that comes before a large, correct decision, the moment before momentum begins. Then she prepared her resignation. She submitted it on a Monday morning, via email to HR, with Garrett Cole copied, giving 8 weeks' notice, more than twice the standard requirement, because she understood the operational implications of her departure and had no interest in leaving problems behind her. She had already begun the transition documentation, annotated process files, system notes, a detailed handover guide for a replacement that was more thorough than anything the company's own procedures required. She was, even in leaving, doing the job at the highest standard she knew how to do it. That was not performance. That was simply who she was. Idris received the HR notification at 9:14 on a Monday morning. He read it on his phone, set the phone face down on his desk, and looked at the window for a long time. He had known, at some level, that this was coming. He had seen the direction she was moving, the certifications she completed quietly, the graduate literature she referenced in meetings, the quality of her questions in operational reviews, which had for some time suggested that she was thinking about problems the company had not yet encountered. He had known she was preparing to leave for something larger. He had simply not let himself think about when. Now he knew when. 8 weeks. And something in the quiet of his office, with his phone face down on his desk, shifted into a different kind of accounting. He had 40 working days left in which to do nothing, the same way he had done nothing for 4 years. Or he could do something else. He did not make the decision immediately. He sat with the notification for 3 days before he did anything at all, which is how Idris Maxwell made decisions about things that mattered. He let them settle, he let the various angles of them become visible, and then he acted. What he was weighing was not simple. On one side was everything he had protected for 4 years, her professional reputation, his own, the integrity of the company, the implicit contract of the working relationship they had maintained with such careful discipline. On the other side was the specific, quiet weight of a thing that had been true for 4 years and that was, in 8 weeks, going to become permanently inaccessible. He had always told himself that silence was the right choice. He had told himself that for so long and so convincingly that he had almost stopped examining whether it was true. On the Thursday before her last Friday, he made a decision. The decision came not in a dramatic moment but in the ordinary way that real decisions usually come, during a drive home, at a specific stretch of Interstate 285, in the middle of a thought that had been building for weeks. He was not going to ask anything of her. He was not going to put her in a position where she needed to manage something she had not asked for. He was simply going to tell the truth, carefully, with full respect for her autonomy, without expectation or pressure, because she was leaving, and the one thing worse than the risk of telling her would be the certainty of never having told her. He had lived with the certainty of silence for 4 years. He understood exactly what it cost. He was not willing to let it become permanent without at least making the choice consciously, in full view of what it meant. He sent her a calendar invite the following morning. The message was brief: "I'd like to take you to lunch on your last Friday. Not a working meeting, just a conversation, and a proper thank you. Let me know if this works." She accepted within the hour, with a brief reply that said she appreciated it and was looking forward to it. She had, at that point, no reason to interpret the invitation as anything other than what it said it was. Idris had been so consistent, for so long, in the register he occupied with her, that she had no frame for reading it differently. He had been, in the most fundamental sense, completely successful at the thing he had been trying to do for 4 years. He had given her nothing to suspect. The weeks between Latifah's resignation and her last day had the texture of an ending that has been anticipated long enough to be accepted but not long enough to stop being felt. She trained her replacement, a careful, capable engineer named Theo who asked good questions and had the particular quality of genuine curiosity that made her confident he would figure out the things she had not managed to document. She attended her farewell team lunch, which Garrett Cole organized with the enthusiasm of a man who had wanted this day to arrive for 3 years and was determined to be magnanimous about it now that it had. She smiled through the speeches. She thanked her colleagues with warmth that was real, because whatever the politics had been, the people on the floor, the technicians, the junior engineers, the operations staff who had worked alongside her on the hardest days, those people had been genuinely good to her, and she was genuinely going to miss them. On the morning of her last Friday, she sat at her desk for a few minutes before opening her laptop. She did not perform the moment. She simply let it be what it was, the last morning in a space she had occupied for 4 years, where she had solved problems and built things and proven, daily, that she belonged in every room she had entered. The particular light through the east-facing windows. The low hum of the HVAC system that she had stopped consciously hearing about a year into the job. The familiar geography of a workplace that had been challenging and political and technically demanding and, in spite of all of that, or perhaps because of it, one of the most professionally formative experiences of her life. She was going to miss it. She let herself know that without rushing past it. Then she opened her laptop and finished her morning. At noon, Idris met her in the lobby. He had chosen a restaurant called Adiz, a West African place on a side street in the West End neighborhood that he had been going to since his father had first taken him there years earlier. It was not a place he brought clients or colleagues. It was a place he brought people he was not performing for. The choice was deliberate, though he had not articulated it to himself in those terms. He simply knew it was the right place for what he needed to say. They drove separately and arrived within minutes of each other. They were seated at a corner table near the window, with afternoon light coming in at an angle that made the room feel warm and unhurried. They ordered. They talked, about the transition, about Theo, about the Melbourne program and what she was most looking forward to, about a new systems initiative Idris was considering for the coming year. The conversation had the ease of two people who had spent 4 years learning each other's professional language and no longer had to translate. Then the food came, and they ate in the comfortable silence of people who do not need to fill every quiet. It was Latifah who would say, later, that she had felt something shift in that silence. Not a premonition, she was not a person given to premonitions. More like a change in atmospheric pressure, the kind that arrives before weather. She noticed it without naming it, set her fork down slightly, looked at her plate. And then Idris set his fork down too. He said, I asked you to lunch for 2 reasons. The first is the one I told you, to say thank you properly, not in an office, not in a meeting, not with other people in the room. What you've given this company over these 4 years, the actual work, the problems you solved, the things you built, it mattered. It still matters. Every protocol that came out of your systems analysis, every hour that was saved by your redesigns, every crisis that got resolved because you were in the room, that's real, and it's in the fabric of this company now. I wanted you to hear that without a corporate frame around it. She said thank you, and she meant it. He said, the second reason is harder. He paused in the way that people pause when they are not collecting their thoughts are already collected, but when they are giving themselves one final moment before something becomes irreversible. Then he said, I've been carrying something since the day I interviewed you. I've thought about this moment a lot. Whether to have it, how to have it, what it would mean to have it. I've talked myself out of it more times than I can accurately count. I've told myself all the right things, that you're on my team, that there are power dynamics that make this something I'm not entitled to surface, that the people who spent 4 years deciding my respect for your work was something other than respect for your work would feel confirmed in that interpretation. And I believed all of those reasons. I still believe them. But you're leaving. And if I don't say this now, I will spend the rest of however long I have knowing I was a coward about it. And I've decided I can't live with that as cleanly as I've been telling myself I can. He said, from the day you walked into that conference room, I have admired you. The professional admiration is real, it is absolute, and it has nothing to do with anything else, and I need you to know that first and hold on to it because everything I'm about to say exists alongside that truth and not instead of it. But there was something else, too. Something quieter. Something I didn't invite and have never entirely known what to do with. I've been careful with it, deliberately, consistently careful, Because you deserved a workplace where your competence was the only thing in the room. You deserved to not have to manage something you didn't ask for on top of everything you were already managing. You deserved, every day, to walk into every meeting and every crisis and every ordinary Tuesday knowing that the reason you were there was the reason you were actually there. So I kept it. And I want you to know I kept it on purpose. And if I had it to do again, I would keep it again, because your work and your integrity and your right to do your job without anything complicated around it, all of that mattered more to me than what I felt. He picked up his glass. Drank. Set it down with the quiet deliberateness of a man who has just put down the heaviest thing he has carried in years. He said, I'm not telling you this because I expect anything. I'm not asking you to feel something about it, or do something with it, or respond to it in any particular way. You're going to Melbourne. You're going to do something extraordinary. I know that the way I know when a production system is running at its actual capacity rather than its reported capacity, which is a way of knowing that does not require documentation. And I would not ask you to carry my feelings as weight on top of that. I'm telling you because you deserve to know that you were seen. Not just your work. You. And because I thought the truth, told carefully and without demand, was something I owed you. He said, if life ever arranges itself in a way where this becomes something we both want to explore, if you ever find, at whatever point you're at, that I'm a person worth knowing in that way, then I believe it will find its way to happening. I'm not putting a clock on it. I'm not putting a condition on it. I'm just leaving a door open, and I wanted you to know the door exists. Then he picked up his fork and said, you don't need to respond to anything. Let's finish eating. Latifah sat very still for a long moment. The thing that was undoing her, not dramatically, not visibly, but in the internal way that certain truths undo you, was not the confession itself. It was the fact that she had not seen it coming. This was significant. She was a person who noticed things. She read patterns in data, in systems, in the behavior of machines under stress. She read rooms and people and the dynamics of groups with a sensitivity that had served her well in environments that required her to be alert. She had sat across from Idris Maxwell in meetings for 4 years. She had worked alongside him through crises that revealed character in the specific, unambiguous way that pressure reveals character. And she had not seen this. Not once. Not a flicker. Which meant he had concealed it with extraordinary discipline. And the discipline he had exercised, the care with which he had protected her professional space, the consistency with which he had refused to allow his personal feelings to color his professional conduct, the specific choice he had made, repeated daily for 4 years, to put her work above his own feelings, all of that discipline was now, in the context of what he had just told her, revealed as something it had not looked like from the outside. It had not looked like sacrifice. It had looked like professionalism. Because he had been determined that it would look like professionalism. Because that was the point. She thought about the 4 years. She thought about the meetings where he had listened to her with the particular attention that, in retrospect, she had simply attributed to good leadership, because good leaders listen like that, and she had not allowed herself to look for any other explanation. She thought about the email she had received at 11:45 on a Thursday night after she had submitted a 40-page systems report, 2 words, "This is excellent." She had assumed he was working late. She thought about the morning after the longest production crisis of her tenure, when she had arrived at the facility at 6 a.m. and found a coffee from the place 3 blocks away sitting on her desk, still warm, with no note. She had assumed it was from one of the floor technicians. She had assumed a great many things that, laid side by side, now told a different story. She said, "Deo." Then she stopped. She said, "Idris." He looked up. She said, "Thank you for telling me. And thank you for the way you told me." He nodded, once, with the quiet of a man who was not expecting more than that and was not performing the absence of expectation. She said, "I'm not going to respond the way you're telling me not to respond. But I want you to know, you were not wrong about the room. I hear you. I need to sit with this, because there is a lot of distance between here and where I'm going, and I've learned not to make promises across distance. But the door you're describing makes sense to me. I understand it. And I'm not walking away from this table pretending it doesn't exist." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face settled into an expression she had not seen on him before, not relief, not happiness, not the performance of either, but something quieter. The specific piece of a person who has finally put something down that they have been carrying for too long. They stayed at the table for another 40 minutes after that. They talked about Melbourne, the research laboratory, the city, the particular adjustment of moving to a different hemisphere and finding that winter comes in July. They talked about the company, about where Idris wanted to take it over the next 5 years, about the new systems initiative he had mentioned, which she gave him 2 immediate observations about because she was constitutionally incapable of hearing about an engineering challenge without engaging with it, and he laughed in a way that was free and genuine, the kind of laughter that 4 years of professional distance had kept carefully contained. She noted that laugh. She filed it. In the parking lot outside, in the thin February sunlight of an Atlanta afternoon, they stood for a moment with the particular quality of people who have arrived somewhere new and are not yet entirely sure of the terrain. He said, "Safe travels, Latifah. Go do something extraordinary." She said, "Take care of the machines." He smiled. She walked to her car. He watched her go the way you watch something leave when you have accepted the leaving and are still, despite the acceptance, moved by it. Then he got in his car and sat in the parking lot for a while before starting the engine. Garrett Cole retired 6 months after Latifah's departure. The retirement was framed as voluntary, which it was, technically, in the way that many such retirements are technically voluntary. The engineering division, freed from the political architecture that had organized itself around Garrett's management style, found a new coherence under a division head who valued the kind of direct, solution-oriented thinking that Latifah had modeled throughout her tenure. Theo, her replacement, grew into the role with the steady competence of someone who had been well prepared by someone who cared about the work above politics. The company expanded into 2 new product lines in Idris's 3rd year as CEO. The 400 employees became 470. The reputation that Deshaun Maxwell had built over 20 years held, and then grew. Idris continued running the company with the same measured, evidence-driven leadership that had characterized his tenure from the beginning. He kept his leather notebook. He kept the habit of reading the most substantive technical input first, regardless of where in the hierarchy it originated. He kept making decisions his team did not always understand immediately and almost always respected in retrospect. He did not stop thinking about Latifah. He did not try to. He thought about her the way you think about something you have set down carefully and trust to still be there, not with anxiety, but with a settled, patient knowing that did not require daily management. He had said what he needed to say. He had said it the right way. Whatever came next would come from the truth of that. Latifah flew out of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport on a Sunday morning in late February. The flight was 14 hours with a connection in Los Angeles. She watched Atlanta disappear below the clouds with the specific emotion of someone who is leaving toward something rather than away from something, which is the rarest and most fortunate kind of leaving. She did not write to Idris from the airport. She did not write to him on the plane. She needed the distance to do what distance does, clarify things, or complicate them, or slowly reveal which of the two it is doing. The program at the University of Melbourne was everything she had hoped it would be, and harder than she had prepared for, which was also what she had hoped it would be. She made friends from 4 continents. She published a paper in her 2nd semester in a peer-reviewed journal on smart systems integration that was cited in 3 subsequent papers within 8 months of publication. She found a coffee shop 2 blocks from the campus that opened at 6 in the morning and played jazz at the exact volume that was right for thinking. She built a life in a new city with the methodical intentionality she brought to every environment she entered. She found that Melbourne in autumn looked like nothing she had expected and felt, somehow, immediately like somewhere she was supposed to be. She thought about the farewell lunch. She thought about it the way you think about a conversation that has lodged itself in the architecture of your understanding, returning to it not obsessively but consistently, finding new meaning in it each time the way you find new meaning in a text you are reading in a language you are still learning. She thought about the word careful. He had said he had been careful. She understood what that cost, because she was also a careful person, and she knew from the inside that carefulness is not the absence of feeling. It is the discipline you impose on feeling out of respect for something larger than the feeling itself. She had spent 4 years being careful about her work, her reputation, her presence in rooms that had not always been designed for her. He had spent 4 years being careful about her. The symmetry of that, once she saw it clearly, stayed with her. She sent him an email 7 months into her program. It was a Tuesday evening in Melbourne, which made it Tuesday morning in Atlanta, and she had just finished a long and successful session in the lab and was sitting in the coffee shop with the right jazz volume and a clarity about a great many things that sometimes follows an extended period of good work. The email was brief. It said, "I'm finishing my first full semester. The research is going well, better than I had let myself expect in the planning stage, which I think is the best kind of going well. I wanted you to know. And I've been thinking about the door you mentioned. I haven't stopped thinking about it. I just needed time with the thinking before I said anything about it. I still need more time. But I wanted you to know the thinking is happening, and it is not going anywhere." His reply came the following morning, her time. It said, "I'm glad to hear the research is going well. The better than expected kind is the best kind, you're right about that. Take all the time you need. The door doesn't expire." She read it twice. It was exactly what she needed it to be. Then she went back to work. Latifa Callum graduated from the University of Melbourne 2 years later, on a clear April morning, with a thesis that her doctoral committee described in their formal evaluation as one of the most practically grounded and rigorously evidenced research contributions the program had produced in a decade. The chairman of her committee, a man who had been in the field for 30 years and who did not give compliments he did not mean, told her in the hallway after the ceremony that the industry was going to hear from her for a long time. She thanked him and meant it. She stood in the courtyard afterward with her graduation gown over her arm and a phone that was buzzing with messages from people on 3 continents who loved her, and she felt, with a fullness she had been building toward for years, that she had arrived at the version of herself she had been working to become. She called her mother first. Then her father. Then her best friend from the program, a systems engineer from Nairobi named Amara who was flying home in 3 days and who had, over 2 years of late nights and early mornings in the laboratory, become one of the people she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Then she sat in the courtyard, in the April sunlight of a Melbourne autumn, and she thought about Atlanta. She thought about what the next chapter looked like. She thought about what kind of person leaves a door open for 2 years without checking whether it is still there. She already knew the answer to that. She had known it from the way he had answered her questions in that first meeting. She had known it from the night she submitted the 40-page report and received 2 words at 11:45 p.m. that said everything she needed to know about the quality of his attention. She had known it, if she was being precise about it, for a very long time. She opened her email. She wrote, "I graduated today. I have been thinking about what comes next, and I have been thinking about the door. I think I would like to find out what's on the other side of it, if the offer still stands." She looked at it. She sent it. His reply came 4 hours and 17 minutes later, which accounted for the time difference and for the fact that he was in the middle of a production planning meeting when the notification came through and finished the meeting before he picked up his phone, because he was, consistently and entirely, that kind of person. It said, "Congratulations. The committee was right. And yes, the offer still stands. It always stood. Take your time coming home. We will figure out the rest." She read it standing in the courtyard, with her gown over her arm and the April sun on her face and the sounds of the graduation ceremony still dispersing around her. And she smiled, not the professional smile, not the public smile, not the careful smile she had learned to wear in rooms that required her to manage how she was received. The real one. The one she gave to very few things, and only when she meant it without reservation. There is a version of this story that gets told as a romance. And it is a romance, eventually, in the way that things that are built slowly and protected carefully tend to be when they finally open. But before it was a romance, it was something else. It was a man who looked at a person he admired and made a decision, every single day for 4 years, that her professional dignity was more important than his personal desire. It was a woman who walked into rooms that were not designed for her and filled them with work so excellent that the rooms eventually had to reconfigure themselves around her presence. It was a workplace where the most powerful person in the building used his power to protect someone who had less of it, not by shielding her from difficulty but by refusing to add to the difficulty that was already there. 1,461 days of silence. Not because he did not feel anything. Because he felt too much to risk doing it carelessly. That is a rare thing. In a world that moves quickly and loudly and that tends to reward those who announce themselves first and loudest, a person who keeps something precious quiet because the time is not right, and who keeps it quiet correctly, without bitterness, without it bleeding into the professional life that runs parallel to it, and without losing it in the keeping, that person is worth paying attention to. That story is worth telling. And now you have heard it. If this story stayed with you, if something in it felt true to something you have lived or witnessed or hoped for, share it with someone who needed to hear it today. These are the stories that do not make the news. These are the stories that happen in offices and on production floors and in farewell lunches in quiet restaurants, between people who are trying their best to do the right thing in circumstances that make the right thing complicated. They deserve to be told. And they deserve to be heard. Thank you for watching. We will see you in the next one.